Hello, Bryn. I just requested another book from the library and noticed that we only have 7 days left with this borrowers, and we're only so far in. Um, so this might have to be return it to the library and then ask for it back. But we're gonna do another chapter tonight, maybe two. I'll probably upload them separately though. Okay, chapter 4. Pod came in slowly, his sack on his back. He leaned his hat pin, with its dangling name tape, against the wall, and on the middle of the kitchen table he placed a doll's teacup. It was the size of a mixing bowl. "Why, Pod," began Homily. "Got the saucer too," he said. And he swung down the sack and untied the neck. "Here you are," he said, drawing out the saucer. "Matches it." He had a round, currant bunny sort of face. Tonight it looked flabby. That's not very flattering at all. "Oh, Pod," said Homily, "you do look queer. Are you all right?" Pod sat down. "I'm fair enough," he said. "You went up the curtain," said Homily. "Oh, Pod, you shouldn't have. It's shaken you." Pod made a strange face. His eyes swiveled around to Arietti. Homily stared at her mouth open, and she turned. "Come along, Arietti," she said briskly. "You pop off to bed now like a good girl, and I'll bring you some supper." "Oh," said Arietti, "can't I see the rest of the borrowings?" Pardon me. "Your father's got nothing now, only food. Off you pop to bed. You've seen the cup and saucer." Arietti went into the sitting room to put away her diary, and took some time fixing her candle on the upturned drawing pin which served as its holder. "Whatever are you doing?" grumbled Homily. "Give it here. There, that's the way. Now off to bed, and fold your clothes, mind." "Good night, Papa," said Arietti, kissing his flat white cheek. "Careful of the light," he said mechanically, and watched her with his round eyes until she had closed the door. "Now, Pod," said Homily when they were alone, "tell me, what is the matter?" Pod looked at her blankly. "I've been seen," he said. Homily put out a groping hand for the edge of the table. She grasped it and lowered herself slowly onto the stool. "Oh, Pod," she said. There was silence between them. Pod stared at Homily, and Homily stared at the table. After a while she raised her white face. "Badly?" she asked. Pod moved restlessly. "I don't know about badly. I've been seen. Ain't that bad enough?" "No one," said Homily, "hasn't never been seen since Uncle Henry, and he was the first, they say, for 45 years. A thought struck her, and she gripped the table. "It's no good, Pod. I won't emigrate." "No one's asked you to," said Pod. "To go and live like Hendry and Loopy in a badger's set? The other side of the world, that's where they say it is, along with earthworms?" "It's 2 fields away above the spinney," said Pod. I wonder what spinney is. Maybe it's like a mill of some sorts, like the windmill, or perhaps they mean like a water wheel. Anyways. "Nuts, that's what they eat, and berries. I wouldn't wonder if they don't eat mice." "You've eaten mice yourself," Pod reminded her. "All draughts and fresh air, and the children growing up wild. Think of Arietti," said Homily. "Think of the way she's been brought up, an only child. She'd catch her death. It's different for Hendry." "Why?" asked Pod. "He's got 4. "That's why," explained Homily. "When you've got 4, they're brought up rough, but never mind that now. Who saw you?" "A boy," said Pod. "A what?" exclaimed Homily, staring. "A boy." Pod sketched out a rough shape in the air with his hands. "A boy." But there isn't, I mean, what sort of boy? I don't know what you mean by what sort of boy. A boy in a nightshirt? A boy? You know what a boy is, don't you? Yes, said Homily, I know what a boy is, but there hasn't been a boy not in this house 20 years. Well, said Pod, there's one here now. Homily stared at him in silence, and Pod met her eyes. Where did he see you? Asked Homily at last. In the schoolroom. Oh, said Homily, when you were... Sorry, I forgot she has bad grammar. When you was getting the cup? Yes, said Pod. Haven't you got eyes? Asked Homily. Couldn't you have looked first? There's never nobody in the schoolroom. And what's more, he went on, there wasn't today. Then where was he? In bed. In the night nursery, or whatever it's called. That's where he was. Sitting up in bed with the doors open. Okay, I'll deal with that later. Well, you could have looked in the nursery. How could I? Halfway up the curtain? Is that where you was? Yes. With the cup? Yes. I couldn't get up or down. Oh, Pod, wailed Homily, I should never have let you go, not at your age. Now look here, said Pod. Don't mistake me. I got up all right. Got up like a bird, as you might say, baubles or no baubles. But, he leaned forward toward her, afterward, with the cup in me hand, if you see what I mean. He picked it up off the table. You see, it's heavy like. You can hold it by the handle like this, but it drops or droops, as you might say. Oh! You should take a cup like this with 2 hands, a bit of cheese off a shelf or an apple. Well, I drop that, give it a push, and it falls. And I climbs down in me own time and picks it up. But with a cup, you see what I mean? And coming down, you've got to watch your feet. And as I say, some of the baubles was missing. You didn't know what you could hold on to, not safely. Oh, Pod, said Homily, her eyes filled with tears. What did you do? Well, said Pod, sitting back again, he took the cup. What do you mean? Exclaimed Homily, aghast. Pod avoided her eyes. Well, he's been sitting up in bed there watching me. I'd been on that curtain a good 10 minutes, because the hall clock had just struck the quarter. But how do you mean he took the cup? Well, he got out of bed, and there he was standing up. I'll take the cup, he said. Oh! gasped Homily, her eyes staring. And you give it him? He took it, said Pod, ever so gentle, and then, when I was down, he gave it to me. Homily put her face in her hands. Now don't take on, said Pod uneasily. He might have caught you, shuddered Homily in a stilted voice. Yes, said Pod, but he just gave me the cup. Here you are, he said. Homily raised her face. What are you going to do? She asked. Pod sighed. Well, there isn't nothing we can do except... Oh, no, exclaimed Homily. Not that. Not emigrate. Not that, Pod. Now I've got the house so nice and a clock and all. We could take the clock, said Pod. And Arietti? What about her? She's not like those cousins. She can read, Pod, and so a treat. He don't know where we live, said Pod. But they look, exclaimed Homily. Remember Hendry? They got a cat and... Now, said Pod, don't bring up the past. But you've got to think of it. They got the cat and... Yes, said Pod, but Aglatina was different. How different? She was Arietti's age. Well, they hadn't told her, you see. That's where they went wrong. They tried to make her believe that there was nothing but what was under the floor. They never told her about Mrs. Driver or Cramp Furl least of all about the cats. There wasn't any cat, Homily pointed out, not until Hendry was seen. Well, there was then, said Pod. You got to tell them, that's what I say, or they try and find out for themselves. Pod, said Homily solemnly, we haven't told Arietti. Oh, she knows, said Pod. He moved uncomfortably. She's got her grating. She doesn't know about Aglatina. She doesn't know about being seen. Well, said Pod, we'll tell her. We always said we would. There's no hurry. Homily stood up. Pod, she says, we're going to tell her now. There's 2 pictures in this chapter. One of Arietti saying good night. And a second one of Pod and the boy. And now I've got to check on my infernal oven. Hope you're having a good day. Love you, kiddo.